Once upon a time, there was a poor widow who lived in my neighborhood. She had two little girls who were both orphaned, who she adopted, and all she owned was a modest field. She began to plow the field so that she could feed her children. But Moses came and told her, "Don't plow with an ox and an ass together," quoting Deuteronomy. Then she began to sow the field. She began to plant crops instead so she could have something to eat. But Moses came once more and he said, "Don't sow the field with mixtures of seeds," from Leviticus. So she began to harvest the crop after what was left. But Moses came once more and said, "Leave the gleanings and the edge of your field for the poor." So she gathered the harvest. But once more Moses came and said, "Give the tithes to the priests and the Levites." She gave it all to him. She had nothing left except her field, so she sold her field and used the money to buy 2 sheep so that she could clothe her children from their fleece and gain profit from their offspring and milk. The sheep gave birth, but then Aaron came and demanded the firstborns of each sheep. As it states, every firstborn you must sanctify to God. So she had to give him the lambs. Then when she came to shear the sheep, Aaron came again. And he said, "Give me the first of your fleece." For he said, "God gave it to me." As it states, the first of the fleece give to him, the priest. She stood there crying with her 2 daughters. This is what they, Moses and Aaron, did to that desperate woman. This is what they do to poor people in our community, and they pin it all on the word of God. This sensational speech is actually in the midrash, and the midrash puts this speech in the mouth of Korach, our antagonist this week when we read and study parashat Korach. Korach, the man who tried to lead a rebellion against Moses, claiming that Moses was hogging all the power for himself, that he had made himself and his family too great. Korach, the man who appealed to a rhetoric which sadly is increasingly familiar to us, suggesting, as it says in our parashah, that Korach says, "All people are holy, all of us are fit to lead. There's nothing special about you, Moses and Aaron." Korach's always been a hard figure to understand. More often than not, I think we find ourselves sympathizing with him. After all, isn't he just being democratic? Isn't he just challenging an authority that, let's be honest, seems a little dictatorial to begin with? Well, yes and no. What the Midrash shows us is that Korach actually may have more going on than what's in Parashat Korach. Lots of the story is missing. And while, from what we read, Korach's issue with Moses may seem legitimate, especially as egalitarian moderns who like to think that we're democratic above all else, Korach actually may have been using his rhetoric for something far more nefarious. Korach wasn't necessarily as radical and progressive as it seems when we first read it. If we look closely, it actually seems like he was quite a hypocrite himself. Korach doesn't say that he wants Moses to abdicate his power so the Israelites could be ruled by some ancient parliament or congress. He doesn't say that he wants direct democracy. He's not an anarchist who wants to remove all authority over the people. He seems to suggest that it's not Moses who should be in charge, but himself. He partially reveals this by partnering with the Reubenites, one of the tribes which usually are not very significant, but if we remember, they're the firstborn. Reuben was Jacob's firstborn son. So it's possible the Reubenites had a lot of resentment against Moses, himself from the tribe of Levi, like Korach. And Korach uses this resentment, it seems, to try and not change the political structure, not actually promote lasting and significant restructuring of society to make it more equal and more balanced, but rather simply to replace one leader with another. Perhaps we can see Korach not as the sympathetic anti-hero that we're often quick to do, but actually as one of the first warnings against populism and demagoguery. Someone who claims to speak for the masses, but actually does very little to represent their voice, is no more legitimate than the authoritarian dictator they say they're opposing. Korach says that he's there to represent everyone being equally holy, but his actions don't really represent that at all. And actually, he doesn't follow through at all on his promise of making sure that there will be more egalitarian distribution of resources. In times of fear and uncertainty, it's easy to listen to people like Korach. He's persuasive, he makes a compelling argument. He naturally gains our sympathy, especially when we've seen Moses really struggle in his role as a leader. Korach seems to get it. He knows what a bad state we're in. He'll fight for us. He'll make sure we're heard. Like the story of the widow that Korach tells according to the midrash, he uses people's fear and resentment and anger in order to stoke them to be able to support him. Not to support themselves, but to support him. Korach says he'll fight for us, but he doesn't. Korach fights only for himself. Today, when we, in various countries around the world, once more find ourselves embroiled in many debates that sound a lot like those of Moses and Korach, maybe we should take a step back, and maybe we should have some suspicion of who the leaders are that claim to speak on behalf of the people. Does this or that demagogue that claims to restore our honor actually fight for our causes? Do they actually want to change things to give the people power, the power that the people deserve? Or do they just want to speak for us instead of with us? As is often the case, many of these leaders, molded in Korach's image, they speak to use us and our grievances only to advance themselves. The widow, whose story Korach tells in the midrash, has a very legitimate reason to be angry at Moses. What that story shows is that sometimes the laws that Moses interprets from God in the Torah can be very unjust, and when applied in the way that is described, a pretty narrow set of circumstances, but nonetheless, it can be really harmful, can cause a lot of suffering. And Korach is capitalizing on that unfortunate circumstance, the fact that in some cases the laws of the Torah and of Moses may actually be quite counterproductive to people's flourishing, in order to cast a broader net, in order to sell a broader initiative, in order to suggest that Moses is the problem and not the unequal application of laws. It's the targeting of the leader by another leader which should really raise our hackles. A good leader doesn't promote themselves, but promotes the system and policies that they want to put in place. They represent a change in an overall political system, not a change simply in political leadership. Although the circumstances of parashat Korach are long in the distant past, Korach still lives, and his rhetoric may be more tempting than ever. But the warning of the Torah remains. The demagogue who argues for democracy is probably the person most in danger of making themselves a dictator. Shabbat Shalom.